Thank you so much for waking up early and calling into Startup Boston Week today. My name is Sarah Lee. I'm the CEO of Relavo, a medical device venture coming out of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and I'll be moderating today's session titled Bringing an Idea to Life, the Who, What, Why, and How of Prototyping. So here with me today is an incredible group of panelists who've brought years of experience in entrepreneurship and prototyping from a wide range of industries. So first up, we have Tasha Rays from Cambridge, Mass. Tasha is a serial entrepreneur who's had a long career in the textiles industry, starting her career at Tommy Hilfiger before founding her first startup, Tasha Hayes Couture and Children's Collective. She then spent over 7 years at Spanx as their senior director of product design and development before beginning her second startup. About 3 years ago, she joined the Advanced Functional Fabrics of America group at MIT as their chief product officer, where she's led the design and development of digital and advanced technology textiles. Now she runs her own consultancy focused on textile product development. Next, we have Alif Mahmoud. Alif is a self-described hacker, starting his engineering career in the defense space, where he worked on autonomous planes and fighter jets using AI before joining Shapeways as an early adopter of AWS before moving to Boston in 2014. There, he started a company called Protoware to develop AI and robotic technologies for Boston-based companies before starting his latest project in developing cloud infrastructure for healthcare companies to rapidly scale. Thanks for being here, Alif. And lastly, I'm joined by Claudio Quintana, a graduate of Boston College, where he studied information systems and marketing. So since 2016, Claudio has worked in a variety of positions at different startups around the area of e-commerce, and he's now on his third company, which focuses on industrial design. Previously, he founded Mojo Crate, which managed e-commerce experiences for community-based lifestyle brands. And his innovative work has included introducing SMS payments and leveraging AI for organic SEO and marketing. So welcome everyone again, and thank you so much for being here. So to kick things off, as you know, this would have been an in-person conversation, but was forced to go virtual due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know this is probably something that everyone's a little tired of thinking about and talking about, but I'm sure it's on everyone's minds. And I know it's been on the minds of the student interns at my company. So I'd like to pose the question to all of you. How has COVID impacted your work in product development, especially with respect to prototyping? Tasha, why don't you start?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think the obvious challenge that we've all had is the in-person piece. So when you're dealing with physical goods or hardware, you need a prototyping facility. And that's been a major challenge for those of us who work in the physical world. But if you have the right partner, the right manufacturing partner who can prototype with you, virtual communication and the virtual tools that we have for design as far as 3D simulation goes has been incredibly helpful. But I think it has been a challenge, especially for students and individuals who need to get into a lab and make things with their hands. It has been incredibly challenging.
Great, I can definitely relate to that as I'm still a student as well. So Claudio and Alif might be on a little bit more of the software end. So Claudio, why don't you touch upon how COVID has impacted some of your work?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I can actually address this as well from like a physical perspective, but it really sort of, as Tasha said, it challenges you to think beyond about what you normally would have had access to in a studio or in the bigger production environments. I can say I worked on a collaborative chair project in July with someone who was in South Dakota, and we had another partner that was in New York. And it's sort of, you have to go back to the basics. We were working with cardboard from our Amazon delivery boxes. We were working with paper that we sourced, from a local office supply store that was open. And, it sort of gets you to go back to the basics and think about, what you can do with the resources around you. And I'll highlight just one quick example that you can actually see this happen in real time if you go back to social media. there was this chair design project called the DIY Chair Challenge, and it had hundreds of people around the world all submitted these designs, and a lot of the winners of this competition, it was hosted by two industrial designers, and it was just a volunteer, just free open event, just through Instagram. And some of the winners of this challenge were people that did not have access to big materials. They did not have access to studios. They just had the resources around them. So I think this challenge definitely, just the COVID crisis in general has gotten you to think beyond the studio. So I think that's been super fascinating, and I think I personally have grown as a designer because of it. And I think that it'll be a good lots of good things to come out of it. Where you can find them. But.
Great, thanks, Claudia. And Alif, do you want to close out this question?
Sure, yeah. I found it kind of exciting and liberating at the same time, because what we're seeing, at least in the tech atmosphere, is, prior where like everybody was in the office and labs, we were collaborating. It was really tight collaboration. We'd work late together. Now we're like working late together, but from our living rooms. So remote services have become like our means of prototyping altogether. So, it's caused every organization I know of to like transition to new virtual tools that we're not accustomed to. And some of the tools are fantastic. Like now we're just very tightly connected from a virtual space. But from a prototyping perspective, it's caused challenges in the viewpoint of like when we start manifesting our hardware systems. So for instance, like let's say we're working on like a new kind of autonomous vehicle, and I got to go flash the new software onto the computer of that system. And a lot of times there's an air gap in those systems, so we don't have like unintentional malware going. So I'm like, well, someone's got to go into the lab, and now you're flipping a coin and checking out like, oh, who's gonna go in, who's gonna bite the bullet. We've had to implement much stronger practices in terms of safety, because we still need to go in at some point. And what that's required is that there's very limited hardware prototyping, and a lot of the prototyping is taking place at home for many of the engineers, which in the end what that means is like now I'm shipping something to California and they're like, check out my prototype, and then they're shipping it back to me. It's like, I made a change. I'm like, why don't you just send me a picture? Like just send me a design file or something. So it's kind of pushing all of us from engineering side to like evolve our thinking process. Like, okay, we're gonna have to do this remotely, including the hardware design as well as software. The software has always been easy because of Git repos and just like cloud computing. But now the hardware is kind of following that transition. And I do firmly believe that when we come out of this pandemic phase, that we're going to be very evolved, both not only from a software perspective, from remote services, but from a hardware development that suddenly is going to be like very, very distributed. Also, and I know none of us really touched on this too much, but I've also found that, our global supply chain have gotten stricter now because of what we're seeing with the pandemic impact. And a lot of the work I do is like multinational, like, I'm in Europe, I'm in Asia, I'm in, blah, blah, blah. So we're finding that like certain areas we're like, okay, we're gonna limit our exposure in this geographic region because of the volatility of what's going on there. And that's changing how we perceive like not only product development of like, developing specific technologies or going through manufacturing. Like I'm no longer ramping up in certain parts of Asia for production, right? But at the same time, it's also changing how we do product rollout. Like I'm gonna roll out products like regionally only, and then explore if it's worthwhile to go abroad at that point, depending on the volatility of that region. So it's really, it's pushing us to drastically evolve in a way that we haven't perceived before. But I think it's gonna be positive. I think we're gonna come out of there very, very robust.
Great, thanks, Alif. Yeah, those are some really great insights just about how, with everyone making all these adjustments now to do prototyping and product development at home, I think it's definitely going to be carrying forward a little bit. But now I wanted to ask you about how have some of the techniques and capabilities changed in your industry with respect to ability to prototype in the last 5 or 10 years, and how have those sort of set you up to be able to be successful during the COVID pandemic?
It's the techniques and capabilities have changed in the sense of like now we have like almost like nodes, right? Nodes like,
Mhm.
you know, this shop does all of our machining. This shop does all of our like quality testing for our software. This shop does all of our assembly. And those nodes are like, you know, quarantine contained. So they're like, okay, if we are in a certain stage, we go there. And we try to have some level of redundancy, but we try to keep everything regional in the sense of like the same coast or the same continent, because we're trying to reduce our exposure to certain volatility in like the global economy. What that's essentially inferred is that like, you know, remote services tools like, you know, using AWS or using Slack or using, you know, you name it, Jira, what have you, have exploded. Everybody's on there now. You know, if you asked me 10 years ago, like, hey, are you using Jira and you're using AWS? Most people would be like, oh, no, I heard about it, but I don't really know. But now, like, we're all over there. We're all virtual. We're all wired, you know, constantly connected, constantly getting updates. And, you know, the offset of that is that, like, well, we're becoming more efficient. I'll mention that much in terms of like our virtual tooling. And then how to manifest into hardware, you know, it's the same idea, same node structure, right? Certain groups will do certain things and they'll do it very efficiently. But then, you know, now you have to, what you really deal with is like, how do you manage all those nodes? You know, how do you track all those updates? How do you keep up with like your development cycle so that you go into certain layers of prototyping and assessment? You know, where does it have to be? So it just becomes like this, you know, dance of like, what are all these groups and what are they doing and where are they going? And it's very easy to lose track of your goal from your inception stage of product development. Like, I wanted to build this product. Now I'm just managing the process, right? So you have to kind of bring yourself back. So I find that like it's very interesting. Like in the 5-10 years, you know, we've evolved drastically in terms of our remote capabilities, but it's very easy for us to now lose sight of our goal of focusing on the customer and just focusing on the process because there's so much to manage now, right? So I think there's a little bit of like soul searching going on, at least in the tech space and among friends of mine's, collaborators and coworkers of mine, where we're all thinking about like, okay, so we're always online, we're always getting all the stimulus from all of these different sources. How do we focus and prioritize and make sure that we're achieving what we're supposed to do, not just get wrapped up in like a constant process of developing new technologies?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Tasha, do you have anything to add about how prototyping capabilities and techniques have changed in your industry in the last five or
I
10 years?
mentioned early the simulation tools. I mean, they're much more advanced with, you know, I work with hardware, but it's really software. It's, you know, it's fabrics and cloth. And there's software like Clo that has enabled us to simulate drape and even almost visualize hand. That has come a long way. But I think really the number one change is mentality. The mentality in doing things virtually has shifted greatly. I mean, I used to fly to a factory somewhere on the globe and physically be there and physically make with my manufacturing partners. And now it's much more acceptable to do these things through video and virtually. So I think it's more about acceptance and the mentality of not having to physically be in the presence of someone and along with the simulation tools that we have that can really help execute physical product in a virtual world.
Yeah, that's great. That all makes a lot of sense. Um, okay, so let's backtrack a bit and talk a little bit about the early stages of prototyping now. Claudia, you mentioned a little bit of that when you're talking about kind of getting back to basics and going into basic rapid prototyping materials.
Yep.
So what would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions about rapid prototyping?
So I'll answer that from a even slightly more DIY. That, you know, someone who's in the audience who's thinking, I've got this idea and it's easy to go search on the internet, and then you're now convinced you now need to save up $10,000, and then you now need to go hire this. I hear people all the time, they'll ask me like, I need to go hire these 10 people to do these 10 things. And I'm like, can you take a step back and can you make this out of paper? Can you draw this first? Can you make a prototype? So in terms of the rapid home stuff, you know, you've got a huge opportunity there to build things out of what you have. and sort of this idea of the MVP, of the minimum viable product, but in a prototyping sense, might even exist before you've even built the prototype. It's so easy now to, I've now been able to do it myself, but you can very easily find someone to help you do a digital rendering of a product or digital sketches. You can hire local students or hire someone on Fiverr, and maybe the first version of this sometimes is really just the testing of it. So can you put up an Instagram post? Can you run a Facebook ad for $10? Can you reach out to your mailing list? And that sort of first stage of data collection is what I think a lot of people miss when they have this great idea and they want to then go spend the commitment of investing into their idea. I think if you just take one step back and you pair that idea with a little test, you don't need to give your idea away to the world. You can give the problem away and see if it's a problem that people resonate with. So I think to that effect, that's sort of where I recommend, I think I see people miss that first step quite a bit. And so I think that's probably where I'd go to when you're starting there.
Great. So you mentioned that a lot of times people will sort of get wrapped up in all this research and think they need really high level tools to make this first prototype. But
yeah.
What advice would you give about when is the right time to start prototyping?
So I think one is, if you're excited about a project, go for it, right? If you have the ability to build something, nothing stops you. So I think, sort of like having an itch to scratch. If you have something you want to do, I'd recommend doing it, because the sooner you get into doing something, you'll realize if it's something you're willing to keep doing, versus fantasizing this future of selling 1,000 products or having this thing in a store or having this future version. So I think the sooner you can make something feel real, the sooner you can start learning if it's a relationship with this object or idea is worth pursuing. And then I think the second piece of that is just getting feedback, validation, whether it's selling something. I think I always have this like $20 test I ask someone. If you go to someone else on the street and you tell them, I have this idea, if I gave it to you tomorrow, would you pay me $20 for it? And if you can't find anyone to do that, there's something that you should address, right? Maybe you're going to the wrong person. Maybe the idea is a little off. Maybe you're not marketing it well. So I think that's the quick way I'd suggest. Getting that momentum. It's all about momentum, right? And then, I don't know if we'll talk about it now or later, but I can sort of also give ideas on where I'd go from, next after this tasbut yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think we'll jump into that part of the question a little bit later, but I wanted to give Tasha a chance to touch on that question as well. And also, more importantly, how do you know when you're done prototyping?
So I think starting to prototype immediately is key. And I think some entrepreneurs are afraid to start prototyping because they're afraid of failure. And what if the fantasy of this idea that they have in their mind is going to fail? So I think overcoming that, not being afraid of bad prototypes. Like the first time you make something, it's not going to be the right materials. It's not going to look perfect. It's part of your process of getting to the product that you want, and overcoming your fear of that and being okay with things not being perfect is really, really important. And for designers and people who want things to look sleek and shiny, getting comfortable with the ugly. And then I always say, you know when to stop prototyping when you have the smile factor. When you take it to someone and they smile, I've always known when someone smiles, they're excited about it. And obviously it has to work, but I really think about the smile factor and try not to over design. Sometimes designers and makers want to keep finessing, but if the product, you're getting positive feedback on the product, it looks like a professional product, and you think it's ready to go to the next test phase or whatever it is, try it. Stop there, get some feedback, and then make your decision So yeah, just don't over prototype.
Yeah, that all makes sense. It's definitely hard, especially from a student perspective, seeing all these students in design classes. It's hard to know where to get started since they want all of the bells and whistles on their first prototype.
Right, right. Yeah,
That's great.
you have to, you know, start simple. Start with one feature. Start simple. Yeah.
Claudia, you touched upon this a little bit about going out and asking your customers, would you pay for this? Um, so how do you go about the evaluating feedback, the process of getting feedback, and how does the customer input weigh against opinions of other people, like industry experts?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. And I think Tosh actually touched on it with this idea of not having, messy is sometimes good because um, when you've got this sort of low fidelity or sort of rough model, when you're testing a model, for example, you want to know what you're testing when you're asking someone that question. So when I mentioned that question of asking someone if they'd pay $20 for something, you want to be careful to know what you're testing. So maybe you're just giving them a question like, if I solved your problem of missing your one sock every time you do laundry, would you pay $20 for the solution? That is the example of what I mean. Someone might be tempted to go stay up all night and create this Velcro zipper bag that can hold two socks together in the washing machine. And then go out on the street and ask someone, would you pay $20 for this bag to solve your problem? They might not say yes to that second example, but if you can ask the first example I gave, where let's validate the problem, that is the momentum that I personally would take to then go spend my weekend trying to figure out the best example of this bag for the washing machine, right? This is a hypothetical example, but this is a problem that everyone, I'm sure watching this, has thought about that problem. But then faced with the actual solution, that's when you start needing to get deeper and deeper. So I think as we just heard about this idea of prototyping as quickly as possible, I think that's definitely what you need to do alongside valuing this, once you've got this idea that you've got a problem that you need to solve, so hopefully that answers your question. But I think that that's sort of the input of information you need, and then you need to know what you're testing with each level of prototype. So if I were to prototype this idea right now, I'd say, okay, this is cool. Can I make something that works? And then, you go from there, and then you figure out the next level. Okay, it works. And then, as Tasha said, the smile factor. Can you then make it something that is just one level better, let someone test it, one level better. So I think it's good to start with the problem that's validated. Now, you did mention an alternative. You mentioned, what if you don't get that validation, or what if it's not out there? That's the element of risk that you have to take if you want to do something that's new or different, or something that people are afraid to tackle. And the process of experimenting and prototyping is the fastest way to learn or to get a new idea. You might realize that socks wasn't the problem, it was something else. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, definitely. Customer discovery and talking to all of the stakeholders involved is always such a critical step in the process. Alif, I wanted to touch upon your opinion a little bit, since at least on the software side of things, the prototyping life cycle is typically shorter in that turnaround time. So how do you evaluate when you're done prototyping, and at what checkpoints do you go solicit feedback from others?
Um, Software is very misleading. I find that there's a misconception that oh wow, you can just do it tonight and have something, right? I always reference the Pareto rule. It's going to take me 20% of my time to get 80% of the value. Then I'm going to spend the last 80% of my time getting the final 20% to meet customer expectations. So I prototype very, very often, right? So we've subsets, and we make it a very methodical process, like agile development, and everybody's heard these terms, but we drink the Kool-Aid and we do go through the cycles. But we've stopped calling it MVPs because we don't want people thinking like, okay, I can go to market with this product. It's like, no, it's not ready. It is not even close. So we call it proof of concept, or I'll just call it like napkin engineering, where I'm like, hey, I just did this in the back of a napkin and it's, pseudocode, and don't even like tell anyone about it, right? We will prototype very often. We'll talk to marketing and sales like every week. If we can do layers of prototyping and introduce the customers for systematic feedback, that's preference. Because, like I'm coming out of like an old school development process, so like, you want to make checkpoints. And that's kind of come into our realm of like software, and where software goes from bits to atoms of like, imagine you're building the software for an autonomous car, building software for like a new kind of robot, what have you, right? So what we'll do is like, maybe we'll just, write some pseudocode and draw like a user interface and say, hey, here's a paper printout of what the application might look like and where you're pressing. And like, does that feel comfortable to you, right? That's even before I write any software, right? And then I build like a, really janky, and I mean janky, like this is like ghetto application. Like no one should ever see it, but we'll introduce it to people. Like, is this helpful to you? Don't worry about the, the polish, because there is none. I did it. It's not polished, and see if people like it. And just like Claudio and Tasha was mentioning, like you just go through these layers and get closer. What you're really doing is like you're assessing, is it worthwhile for me to continue this path, or should I switch directions? It's And a lot of times as engineers and designers, we wonder like, oh, am I just questioning myself? No, what you're questioning is the value added to your customer. If it's not adding value to your customer, why are we even doing it? We're doing it to help people, not to just, satisfy our need to build things. That's not really why we're here. So what you're really validating is like with each layer of proof of concept and prototype, which you should be doing from day zero, your first day of your idea, like let me just write it on a piece of paper and draw it, right? That's a prototype, just a piece of paper, napkin engineering, that's good enough. You're really validating from day zero, like, is this adding value, right? And then when you go through those layers, you're gonna need different tools, yes, but you'll understand by that point, like as I talk to customers, who's my user persona, who's my representative? Is it a soccer mom, age 35 to 45, that needs to like, move her kids? Is it, someone in college, 18 to 22, that needs to have easier access to the tool? Who's that persona? Let me get in front of that person as soon as possible and ask them like, what do you think? What's going on? How do you feel about this? And as you progress through it, then you can invest in, better tools and better infrastructure. I normally always advocate that, like, if you're gonna prototype, use open source tools. There's just so much free stuff out there. Open source is fantastic, and support the community. When you take a little bit of open source, put a little bit back. It's fantastic because you build up your reputation. And when you transition from bits to atoms, as you go up the layers of prototyping and you're validating, bring it into maker spaces. There's a lot of great maker spaces distributed across the country. I personally like Artisan Asylum, like Somerville. They're fantastic. You take into a maker space and you start prototyping there, and you just have people walk by and you just ask strangers. It's critical to ask people that have never seen your product before, your concept, your prototype before, as they're walking by in a maker space, like, hey, what do you think? And they're gonna tell you like, oh, I don't even know what you're trying to do here. This is very confusing. And that's incredibly valuable feedback because you don't have a biased perception or a biased perspective right now, like a spectator. So I found it to be that I'm prototyping from the first day, and I know I'm done when I've hit like every major milestone that we started out with and the ones we found along the way. So for instance, let's say I'm building something, I know I'm supposed to go to FCC, I'm supposed to get these medical device compliances, but then I'm also supposed to like achieve certain goals. But while doing usability testing, I found out that it's just too complicated. It's convoluted to use. So I added in new goals in the development process. They're like, hey, this has to be simpler, 3 clicks, you have to get through the entire operating screen. Once you hit those milestones and it's like you're getting consistent validation, then move forward. Do not hold on to something that, you don't want to get in a spiral of constant development. It's just not healthy. So once you hit enough milestones, move forward, and then let the customers tell you that, you're good or you're not good.
That's great. Awesome. And then I guess sort of touching on that as well, Tasha, why don't we start with you for this, but how does your approach to prototyping and different types of prototypes change depending on who your audience is, who you're trying to get feedback from, and who is the toughest group to prototype for?
Yeah, so I've that's a really good question because you know the early stage prototypes. I know for me, I was always kind of afraid to share them with the leadership team or the management team because I thought they would be judged. Like, oh, it's not the right material, it's not the right this, it's not. And I was found myself always apologizing for the prototype. So what I ended up doing is being very careful about who and when and where I showed my prototype to. And I think you have to, I think it depends on the organization. I think it depends on your audience. I think it depends on the product, because people can have a very negative reaction to a bad prototype. And when you're working in an organization that might have milestones, so like a prototype meeting, an adoption meeting, market week, which is kind of the old school way of how the fashion or the apparel industry used to work. I would never. Sometimes I would have a prototype, at a sales meeting, and I really had to weigh, okay, is the customer going to be able to understand what this prototype is about? So I really think it depends on the organization, it depends on the product, because everybody kind of sees a prototype in a different way. And I think the number one thing you can do is be really honest about your prototype. Be really honest about where it's at, what it's lacking, but what the potentials can be. And be confident, even if you have a bad prototype, be confident in your vision and solicit feedback. Be comfortable with soliciting feedback because you want to hear the bad stuff as well as the good stuff.
That's great. Thank you. Claudio, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that really covers it well. I think the key is to really know the why, right? Why are you asking this question? Why are you asking someone their feedback? Why are you building this prototype? And I think thinking about what you're trying to get out of it is good. I know there was a question on the Slido about how do you do this without leading the witness, right? And I think part of that is being honest, but also knowing, what and just putting a little thought into what you're testing. So it's good to preface if you want someone to think about, is this gonna work in this way? You want to make sure you're asking that, but you also set up the context of, don't worry about the color, we can make this in any color. Don't worry about the material, we can make this in any material. And that even gives you the opportunity to ask them the follow-up question. If you could have this in any material, what would you like? Or what does this remind you of? And so you might even pair, this is a hypothetical, but maybe you're pairing two tests. One is, you've got this primitive prototype, I'm thinking of a hardware piece out of foam, and then you've got another thing that maybe you've got 3 tiles that have 3 finishes on them, and you can ask those questions in both orders to find out the object first and then the finish, and maybe the finish first and then the object. And you're gonna always influence your witness somewhat, especially when you're doing this DIY testing. But the other thing to also remember is that there's also an element, particularly in the more entrepreneurial prototypes, of someone who's trying to create something to sell 10 of or 100 of, or launch a little Kickstarter campaign. But going after your perfect customer does help you, because you get an evangelist early on. And so that can be helpful, having them feel part of this process. So I think that'd be my little feedback.
Great. And then I guess, Alif, let's direct this question towards you. How do you consider the levels of risk when you're approaching a new prototyping challenge? Do you typically go for the low-hanging fruit to make some more tangible progress, or start with the riskiest, most difficult parts? What's your general strategy?
Yeah, so I've never been in a project where time wasn't a priority. So, as much as we want to explore the unknown, which we will inevitably, I highly recommend approaching it from low-hanging fruits, right? So let's say you got features A through B, sorry, A through D, and A is the hardest and D is the easiest. I would recommend go with the easiest and work your way up. It'll do a couple of things for you. Firstly, you'll be able to quickly assess, can I even build part of this product, right? Is it even achievable, attainable? Secondly, it'll help you make a case to your team, your organization, your market that, hey, I'm working towards something that's of value and I can start getting feedback and prototype, right? The risk profile with developments are always very high, whether we're doing software or hardware, right? And especially if you're merging the two. I live in that world where you take software and your hardware and you combine it together. My God, there's like obscene amount of risk from every direction. So we spend a lot of time de-risk, so we'll have contingency plans and we'll have backups for those contingency plans of like, how are we going to build this piece? Can we buy it instead of build it? That is a real question that everyone should ask themselves. It's like, for instance, and that includes developing parts of it, right? So for instance, let's say I've got the option of, if it's software world, I got the option of building, a cloud infrastructure myself or buying it from someone. Is my priority really to build a cloud infrastructure? Or is it to bring value to my customer, right? Is my priority to design a new kind of steering wheel, or is it to have a car that gets my customer from point A to point B? So really think about like, can I buy it instead of building it? And that's kind of brings back to the concept of like, if you have free tools you can use or open source tools, open source software, pull it. You can search on Git and you can find anything. I can point you guys toward like a million different applications out there that are just as good as anything that you can buy. You can bring it in really quickly and it gets you a head start. And what it does is de-risking you along the way so that you can get to your finish line sooner. Because the end goal that you shouldn't lose track of is what will make my customer happy with the product. Not so much like, what's the coolest thing I could build per se. And bear in mind that when you're building a new concept, right, that no one's ever seen, like this is, instead of pressing buttons, I'm gonna wave my hand and it's gonna just know what I'm thinking. That is such a crazy idea. And those are the concepts that I built, right? How does a customer know how to even interact with my product? By changing the interface, the interaction, the experience, the world around the customer, you're increasing risk. So you want to balance that out by decreasing risk elsewhere so that you have a very easy product introduction stage to launch your product. So we spend a lot of time early on, even before we start doing any engineering, like where's our risks here? Is it just that the concept's so new that no one's going to know how to use this thing? Or is it that like, I have to go into deep R&D with the entire research and development team to develop how to like, power this system that never existed? You want to understand that and start de-risking early on and get your first generation out. After you get out your first generation of product, you know exactly where you're missing the mark and making it. At that point, you can take a little bit more risk, say, hey, I'm going to push this envelope here. I'm going to push it there. I'm going to do a little bit more research, get myself like, like hoverboard technology, or I'm going to push myself here. I'm going to make the user interface much more seamless because the core R&D is already really good, but the interactions aren't good enough yet. Reduce your risk, get to market soon, and then reassess. Let the customer, let the market tell you what you need. Do not take on risk and then delay yourself and burn through capital for no reason. And there will never be a situation where you have all the time in the world. You're always going to be like, how can I get there yesterday?
Yeah, that's definitely true about those time restrictions. Tasha, do you have anything to add to that point?
No, I think Alif said it really beautifully. I mean, his
Yeah.
quote, I've never been in a project where time wasn't a priority, is right, and I think also the financial piece of it, getting your product to market and getting feedback so you're not burning capital, but then also consider the investment in prototyping. You really need to consider that piece of it. And I was thinking time and money, like you really have to weigh those two things. So.
Great. Now we're going to start taking some questions from the audience Q&A. So Claudia, why don't you take this one first? How would you define or quantify success or failure?
That's a good question. I think it's a big question. But I think in sort of the context of today, I think it is progress, right? So are you ending up somewhere that's slightly better than where you started? And that might not mean a sale, it might not mean a working prototype, but ideally you've learned something, um, and you've done something, because no one's going to take that away from you. So, just to give you two examples of what I would consider successful is, getting feedback on an idea, putting something out there. As Sasha said earlier, was scary, but doing that I think is good. Alif mentioned earlier that you can, you want to do something that does good. It's going to help people. So, not to make it sound too abstract, but I think those are the ways that I think about these things. And just to add on to that, this can be done on a very small scale. For $100 this weekend, someone who wants to launch a digital idea can go to themeforest.net and buy any WordPress theme for basically any idea. You can build a replica to Etsy this weekend for $100. It's not gonna be perfect, but you can test this idea and you can go to your friends and you've got this marketplace idea. If you have an idea for a product, you can go to makexyz.com, and someone who has a 3D printer down the street, I know there's hundreds in Massachusetts, but anyone who has a 3D printer who's on this network can print something for you in the next 48 hours for $5, $10, $20. So there really is no, if you're willing to invest $100 into just bringing an idea to life, you can be successful this weekend, So I think I would just mark the next level of success you need to get to versus the 20 steps away, I think is what I would think about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. Thanks. Tasha, someone from the audience is asking about who is that smile factor from? Is it from an end user, an investor, leadership, or yourself, your team?
I think it's from anyone, because I think when you're in an organization, whether it's a larger organization or a startup, your customers are your colleagues, your customer, as far as getting on board with a prototype or getting on board with an idea. And certainly the leadership team is your customer, because you want them to believe in the product, you want them to believe in the idea. And then the end customer, if I have an idea, I'm a startup, the end consumer is my customer. So I think it's throughout that spectrum that you want the smile factor, that you want, your organization to be behind it. And of course you want your consumer, as Claudia has said, is going to pay the $20 for it. You want them to smile about it, be excited about it, and willing to give you their $20 for it.
That's really great. That's a good, concise way of putting that, the smile factor. Great. Another question from the audience. One school of thought is a prototype is not the goal, it's just a tool. So as starting a startup, can you comment on how you prioritize or balance all of the related effort, time, and cost that go into these prototypes? Alif, do you want to start off and take that?
I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say time is probably gonna be your most important factor, because the faster you work, and Tasha said it really well, it's gonna be interrelated to your cost. And Claudio highlighted the efforts that's required with every stage. Man, if you can cut down your time, prioritize that, get there sooner. And that will end up defining aspects of your cost and effort. Bear in mind, the longer you're doing it, so let's say you increase your time scale, you're just gonna end up spending more money and having more effort anyway. So I'm just like, why even do that? It's interrelated. So I would prioritize time as much as possible there. And you will find yourself converging. It's a convergence theorem of like, if you're just doing, simple calculus, you're just, you're migrating back and forth and you're converging on where you need to be. And that's time that you're trying to reduce to get there. And if you got to spend a little bit more in that time frame, then I would recommend doing it. Get to the finish line sooner, because there's something that you should all be really concerned about, which is that yeah, you're working on a concept, so is someone else. Someone else out there is doing it, and it may not always be a big company. It might be someone just like you in their garage doing something really cool. And time to market is a real thing. That other person gets there first. They're first to market. They got first mover advantage. They got brand advantage. You can't really replace that. Now you're a fast follower trying to supplant the first mover. So I would take time very seriously, and I would probably spend more just to cut down on time. Now that also reduces the effort in the process, so it's interrelated. It's the triple constraint that we all face with. So. But I'll let the other guys kind of comment on it. They could probably say much more about it than I can.
Yeah, Claudio, do you want to jump in there?
I mean, I think that's pretty well said. I think that this idea of this time to next level of prototype is quite important. But also it's just your learning curve, right? So the faster you can learn, the faster you're going to keep facing these iterations. And not even just people have done what, or not even people are doing what you're doing, most likely, but people have probably already done what you're doing, at least in these early stages of a new idea. So I think the other hidden advantage of being fast in doing something that has already been done is you get to go back to the drawing board faster and faster and faster. And I think that's like the hidden success that I think might be daunting for someone, is I put in all this work and time and now I realize that this already exists. But if you did that efficiently and quickly and you focus on your own process, you're going to be able to do it again the next week for half the cost and half the time, right?
Yeah, that's great. Kind of going off what Alif was saying, that's something I've seen a lot in my company too. As we're an early startup, we're trying to be conservative with funds, but sometimes the money that you're spending to have someone else build this initial prototype from the idea adds a lot more value than taking an extra 6 months to do it from my apartment.
Yeah.
That's great. Tasha, can you talk a little bit about prototyping in continuous trend changes like the fashion industry? How do you get started, or how do you keep up with those trends?
You're all, if I approach it from the fashion industry, you're always chasing the next thing. And luckily, I think things are slowing down in the fashion industry. Consumers are, we're promoting slow fashion and not these every month a new collection. So it's very difficult. I mean, we would work a year and a half. We would start our concepts a year and a half before they actually were in stores. So imagine, over a year and a half, things change. Consumers, what they want changes. So we were constantly chasing the next trend, and it can be very exhausting. But when when you're in an apparel industry or a segment that is not focused on trend, it's more focused on quality and timeless design. That's a little simpler, and you can really focus on the materials and something that's going to last longer. So I think that chasing of trends is what has gotten the fashion industry, for some, kind of a bad reputation. And a wasteful way. So there was a lot of prototyping. There was over prototyping. There was changing our minds 6 months later. So it encouraged, in my opinion, a lot of negative behavior. But you try to predict what the consumer is going to want 18 months from now. And we would follow, all of these services. When you're in an organization that can fund something like that, you're paying for services that help you predict what the consumer is going to want 18 months from now. Now, when you're in a startup, you traditionally don't have those resources, and you're doing the best that you can based on maybe your intuition or what you see in the marketplace or what thought leaders are doing. So, but yes, it is a challenge when you're tracing trends.
Yeah, that's definitely something. Hopefully the trend chasing slows down, as you mentioned, with
Yeah.
more of the environmental concerns with fast
Yes, I
fashion.
think so. I'm seeing a lot more of that.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Great. So we're running a little bit low on time, so I think this will be the last question. But Alif, why don't you start off here and talk a little bit about the importance of the front end design versus the back end engineering and functionality when trying to get your first user.
What type of user is it?
A first B2B user, so something on either the software side or the healthcare side.
Right, right. Okay. If you're doing B2B, so it's a business application, you're probably doing an enterprise sale. And let's say, there's a difference between small business versus large enterprises. You'll want to you'll want to fork the road a bit. You'll essentially in your early stage of prototyping, you should be focusing on design because you're going to propose it to your customer, whether it's small business or enterprise, to see if the applications of interest that adds value in their like customer journey. Let's say the example of like, I want to help this B2B customer get sales more seamlessly by reaching their customer, right? And they do this through a gifting process. So I'm going to send out gifts to the secondary customer of this customer to get them more sales. Well, don't build any back end yet. You're going to spend most of your company startup engineering time building back end. Just prototype, like quick design, like wireframes, right? Design that and show it to these customers and have them, kind of fake press the paper and see like how it moves around. They're like, oh yeah, I see what that's supposed to do and where it goes. And, give them some proxy numbers of like how it's going to get some values. What you're really doing is you're supplanting the existing experience of that customer to add a new kind of application that makes their life easier that you can charge for. That's a critical part. Like you're gonna have to charge for it somehow. Unless it's an open source, then that's amazing. I'm so glad you're doing open source. But you need to figure out early on is from a design side, does it make sense how it's going to be used? And that's really easy to prototype early and you can refine that better later on. As you get like feedback from the customer from like a visual perspective, they're like, oh yeah, I can see what you're trying to do or how it's going to help me. And I prefer to use your interface over the one I'm supposed to do currently. Then you switch gears and you start doing a lot of back end. You're going to be I commonly say like, hey, if you got a software team, it's probably going to be, 50 to 60% back end engineers and then a sprinkling of DevOps, a sprinkling of architects and you got like a couple of front end engineers. You really don't have many front end people. And I always highlight that like you want a front end engineer, but you should also have a UI UX designer because they're focused on user experience. It's different from like front end engineering. So you want to have that kind of balance. So in the beginning, prototype your design, get feedback, right? But do it like really cost effective prototypes. Then switch gears and start investing in the back end. Build up the infrastructure and tools that supports the features that you visually show to your customer. And that'll be true for both small businesses and enterprises. There are some nuances though that you get into once you start forking the road from enterprise and small business. But that's a conversation for different times. I go teach like a class on that stuff.
That's great. Claudio, do you have anything to add, particularly about moving from a proof of concept to an MVP to a full product launch?
Yeah, I think just know what you're testing and know why you're testing it, and it's a mix of you got to make money, right? You got to make sure you're getting closer to something you can sell, and then on the personal side, something that you can sustain your own emotional investment in. I think the sooner you can get to both of those things, and be aware of when those things do not line up, that's I think you'll save yourself a lot of time and money.
Yeah, burnout is definitely something to keep in mind when you're starting a company. So always going after things you're passionate about.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we are out of time now. We have Andy back on the screen, but thank you everyone for logging into the session today. And thank you all to the panelists. It was a really great discussion.